Today, we'll be covering this really important point of what's a good point to start a data exchange system, which is how do you identify the use cases to start from? Very often we realize that this is not really a technology problem. It's really about identifying the right use case and the right kind of impact that a data exchange system can have, and that leads to more adoption. We'll then touch upon readiness assessment of participating bodies. By nature, data exchange system interacts with many government departments, many government ministries, also with the private sector. How do you understand which bodies are ready and can participate in the data section actively? And then we'll also be looking at number 3, which is this whole debate about do we start with, do we go towards perfection, or do we actually make sure that we start with some quick wins? So how do you think about the design and planning and the implementation roadmap of data exchange systems? So these are the 3 critical things that we'll be covering today. I'm joined by Carolyn Flory from ADB. I'll just hand over the mic to her and she can introduce herself. And we're also joined by Adesh Khadka ji, who is Joint Secretary IT and Governance Office as part of the PMO in Nepal. Adesh ji, welcome, and we look forward to hearing your insights as well. Vineet Bhandari, who's the Chief Operating Officer at CDPI, has also joined and was part of the first series as well. He'll be sharing the deep technical work that they do with countries on DPI, especially from a implementation point of view. Look forward to that. And Shashank and Harsh, whose name is not on the slide, are from Dalberg, who've been really critical at building the whole data exchange practice for us here. Moving forward, so we've got a packed agenda. I'll very quickly hand over to Carolyn, and she can run us through a little bit about how ADB is thinking about supporting countries across DPIs and what they've done. If you just go back to the previous slide, Harsh, and then we'll spend about 15 minutes to deep dive into data exchange platforms. And the part that we really all, I'm sure, looking forward to is to really understand a country spotlight, which is how Nepal is thinking about its data exchange platform in the context of its larger data transformation strategy. And we'll do a short fireside chat with Adesh ji. And then we'll get into how should you think about implementation, which is where Vineet from CDPI will come. Hopefully, we'll keep the 20 minutes for Q&A. Till then, just a final note from me, please, if you have any questions, put them on the chat. Try not to sort of unmute yourself in this time period while we're presenting. There'll be an opportunity to do that in the last 20 minutes. And our teams will try and answer whatever questions we can on the chat itself, and then we'll have a live discussion after that. With that, Caro, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kunal. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone on the call. So again, my name is Carolyn Flory. I'm a digital development specialist with the ADB's Digital Sector Office. My area of focus is digital public infrastructure and digital government. And it's been a real pleasure to partner with both Dalberg and CDPI on this series of webinars. So hopefully there are more in our future as well. So I'll be brief in my comments. I wanted to frame the discussion a bit about the newest sector at the Asian Development Bank, which is the Digital Sector Office. So on the screen, what you can see here is the initial digital transformation framework. So our group just had our strategy approved by the president in looking at what is the way that the Digital Sector Office is considering our approach to digital transformation. And so you can see our house that's really built on some of those initial foundations in terms of digital and data infrastructure, policy and regulations, and safeguards. And then the area that we'll focus on, and that's my area of focus on the team in terms of the accelerators, including digital public infrastructure, digital skills and capabilities. And then layered on top of that are those solutions, how we're integrating digital across sectors, across different use cases as well. So we'll dig right into to the work that we're doing on DPI and data exchange. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to present some of our initial thinking and some of the partners. It's great to see both new and familiar names on the list of attendees. Some of you have actually seen, an initial draft of our DPI approach and how we're thinking about the categorization of both our technical assistance, our investment portfolio, as well as the knowledge products that we'll be doing. So 4 pillars of the approach. The first is around that foundational infrastructure that you see on the left of the hand of the slide, looking at both the foundational components as well as the sectoral approaches to DPI. And here, specifically also thinking about the data exchange that we're working on, and we'll give a few examples. And we spoke about the Cambodia example that the ADB is supporting in the last webinar. The second pillar is around the policy and regulatory frameworks, recognizing that those legal and regulatory foundations are really fundamental and can create key risks or bottlenecks in terms of the projects that we're doing. So the modalities that our team will be looking at include policy-based lending as well as investment that builds off of those regulatory changes. The third is around safeguards and accountability. I see one of my newest colleagues, Fumi, is on the call, and she's in the digital risk unit. And so that's really focused on how we're thinking about the cybersecurity implications, the privacy and data protection implications for the DPI work that we're doing. And the fourth is around capacity development. So that strategic technical capacity, working very closely with a number of government agencies. As Kunal mentioned, it's very cross-cutting. So identifying who are those key stakeholders that we'll be working with across not just data exchange and modernization, but also in terms of the cybersecurity, the skill building, the policy and regulatory frameworks, et cetera. Next slide, please, Harsh. So I also just wanted to note some of the other work. Obviously we're one of the, maybe not obviously, but we're one of the newer MDBs to the DPI game. So just wanted to note some of the ways that our colleagues across development partners and MDBs are working, again, looking at some of the same categories in terms of investment. So, we're collaborating with the World Bank in Sri Lanka, and they're supporting investments in terms of some of that foundational DPI. The Cambodia project that I mentioned that will focus specifically on data exchange, but working across a number of line ministries from commerce and public works to land management. So really thinking about those sectoral use cases. I'm really excited to hear about the Nepal case as well. And we have other colleagues that have worked closely on that. In terms of knowledge products, as I mentioned, we have the strategy that has been approved for digital transformation, as well as some other knowledge products. My colleague Arn Tussar is on the call, and he led the development of a DPI landscape for South Asia specifically. And of course, a lot of other work that has been done by our colleagues at the World Bank, the United Nations, UNDP, for example. Technical assistance is another way that we're supporting the rollout and preparation of the work that's being done. And finally, in terms of partnerships, so similar, this webinar is an example of the partnerships that we've been building to link the work that the MDBs are doing, as well as linking with other organizations in country. So, for example, the ADB has a tripartite MOU with Co-Develop and CDPI, who are represented here. We're also working closely with the UNDP DPI Safeguards team, with UNDP on a DPI Stewards program. And there's also, for example, an MDB working groups around DPI and how we can align the work that we're doing, everything from procurement to the way that we're considering things like verifiable credentials, et cetera. So a lot of work that's being done kind of on the back end as well. Also, just to note that those shared investments and shared interest is, again, around that data governance and cybersecurity, the environment, the enabling environment for DPI in the countries that we're working in, regional cooperation, which is a priority for the ADB and for other MDBs as well, and looking at how can we think about cross-border flows of information from ASEAN to CAREC to the Pacific as well. So I'll stop there. That's the last slide, and I'll hand it back over, Kunal, I think, to you as we go into the deep dive. So happy to take any questions. Really excited for the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Carolyn. And any questions, please keep putting them on the chat. We have about 60 people who've joined the call, so that's great. We'll start the data exchange deep dive now. And before we get there, we just wanted to get a sense of the room, and that'll also help us in how we frame, the rest of the slides. Harsh, do you want to bring back the slide? Right. So we want to do a very quick Menti poll. And if you guys have your phones, just use this QR code or just go directly to the menti.com, and there's a code that's on the screen. And can you answer this question for us, which is really trying to understand where the audience is right now in their data exchange, understanding, implementation, level of maturity. So already see some responses come in. We'll give everybody a couple of minutes to fill these out. This is quite interesting. So we're here. Largely looks like the audience has done a lot of thinking already on data exchange platforms. Especially a large majority has already identified use cases. So I think that the approach that we're about to present will resonate with you. And there are about 16 people who said that they understand data exchanges, have identified priority use cases. However, need to think about the readiness assessment, and 10 have actually thought this through. So that's really interesting.
Fait normalement, non? Pas te fait même une semaine à doigt là. Pour aller voir seulement les gars, non? Intègre-moi.
Right. So I think that gave us a good sense of where the room was. And we're looking forward to the questions. But given that I think about 70-80% of the audience has already done a lot of thinking about use cases, feel free to also in the chat share some of your learnings. I think that'll be useful for the group as well. And so with that, I'll hand over to Shashank now to help us just run through what kind of methodologies and approaches can be used to prioritize use cases.
Hey, thanks, Kunal. Harsh, if we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah. So as we kind of engaged with different countries to think about how we can prioritize the starting points or which are the particular sectors and subsectors to pick first when piloting data exchange use cases, we came across two primary axes to look at or assess use cases. One is feasibility in terms of which are the areas where perhaps there are already resources available for institutions, whether those are from the public sector or the private sector. And those resources could mean in terms of technology, in terms of capacity, in terms of overall buy-in, as well as areas which are almost quick wins to be able to show the power of a data exchange. One critical aspect that we kind of uncovered as we were working through some of these problems, which kind of are where to start. We realized that it's important to pick areas which can demonstrate the power of data exchange and what value it can bring to a business, to a particular business use case. So those are some of the things, and we'll go into detail on each of these on both feasibility side as well as the relative impact side. But on the second axis, we have relative impact. And particularly, we are looking at what is the end outcome that can be achieved by bringing a data exchange to life, right? And that is relative in the sense that because we are trying to assess multiple use cases, multiple sectors which can bring in a data exchange, and there's no one right answer in terms of where you can start. Multiple at many occasions there are multiple starting points which kind of like take place in parallel, but in the spirit of prioritizing those, like I said, which can show those quick wins and can highlight the benefits and kind of bring the outcomes to life the soonest, I think those are the ones you kind of end up prioritizing, if I were to summarize this framework. If you were to go to the next slide and we double click into what are the specific aspects when we even mean feasibility, right? As I mentioned, the feasibility goes beyond just technical components, right? It looks at aspects related to institutional maturity, governance, as well as any structural barriers which may be present, or actually the absence of them can benefit the uptake of data exchange. So from an institutional perspective, what matters most is the intent. Are there key kind of strategic leaders present within institutions who kind of see the value of what data exchange can bring, and how it can boost, whether that's productivity, whether that's reach, whether that's overall impact. But a clear business use case has been seen, and there is a leadership push and intent towards following through on that. Second is digitization. Of course, an existing level of digitization is always helpful, as there is, it weighs into how soon the data exchange can be implemented or piloted in this particular example. Governance, whether there is one identified owner of data streams within, let's say, a department or within an organization, plays a huge role in how successful a data exchange can be, because a lot of the conversations we've had actually goes into identifying that clear ownership structure. Who is the owner of the data? Who is the operator of a data exchange? Who chooses and decides on access control and kind of like data management related decisions are clear kind of points, and if they are kind of sorted out and streamlined early on, help a lot in terms of the feasibility of the use case itself. Of course, capacity in terms of the people. If you have champions who have worked in data exchange or have done similar kind of aspects, helps a lot. And lastly is if there are any regulatory and operational kind of challenges, whether that's in the financial sector, for example, there's sensitivity which sharing between departments or between institutions, and so whether those kind of structural barriers have been thought of and ironed out plays a huge role within the feasibility bucket. Harsh, if we can move to the next page. Yeah. So in terms of relative impact, and this is where, like, as Dalberg, we also looked at what is the potential social impact of exploring a data exchange within that particular sector or within that particular sub area, right? And this covers, whether the use case touches upon a large enough end user base who could benefit and who could be included in receiving digital services, which would have otherwise not been possible, right? And whether, and that extends to beyond reach, that also extends to whether there is a true benefit to be realized in terms of whether the cost of delivering digital services or the time and efficiency that is involved in delivering them. Right. And inclusion I've already spoken about. And last is, and I can't emphasize this more, is in any kind of use case prioritization exercise, as part of the buy-in conversations, value demonstration kind of trumps perhaps all these other parameters. Is where value can be demonstrated the most and the fastest, I think, ends up being prioritized as the use case to start with for many countries that we have seen. If we are to move to the next slide. Yeah, a quick question, and we can go back to the same Menti page that we had. Considering these parameters that we just spoke of, like, what would be that one top use case that you would prioritize for your country? Based on what we know or based on what we just discussed, would love to kind of get a sense of the room, how you would go about prioritizing. Like, what is that one area, one sector, one use case that you would treat as high priority for a data exchange pilot in your country, in your institution? Okay, I see some responses come in. It's procurement, healthcare, fiscal data exchange. I see health. So open banking, social security, tax, climate resilience. It's very interesting. Beneficiary eligibility identification. Yeah, these are all great. Agricultural credit. These are all great and perhaps have been tried out in different country contexts. Right, health for is repeating as a key pattern again. So in terms of like areas where data exchange has kind of been tried and kind of experimented with, these all kind of fall there. Yeah, keep them coming. And say, Harsh, if we can flip back to the slide, maybe. Yeah, if you can move to the next page. Yeah. In kind of assessing institutional readiness, this is perhaps the trickiest spot. Uh, we would say in the journey of moving from strategy to implementation, right? How do you even assess readiness? Where do you start? What do you measure? And what does it even mean? Which is in the later part of this session, we'll also cover. Does it mean that if we are not truly ready in the sense of a national scale up kind expectation, can we not take steps to start our data exchange journey? Things which we'll cover later in the session as well. But if we go to the next slide, like structurally, if we were to set up a data exchange for national scale, right? Setting it up in the right way so that it can scale and truly be spread across national use cases. There are 5 things which we saw are important in assessing the readiness of institutions. One is strategic clarity, and this kind of goes back to having that leadership, conviction in the sense of the value which a data exchange can bring in, but also following that through with the right funding and kind of support to ensure it moves from implementation to adoption. Right. So having that strategic clarity. 2 is technical, which I think is clear in terms of investing and ensuring whether the the data systems information, the MISs or the databases are set up in a structured way, or whether the APIs are configured to be able to enable interoperability between different institutions. All of that kind of falls in the technical bucket. We have governance and legal and regulatory, which perhaps kind of get lesser importance, but eventually as the implementation scales up, perhaps become the more crucial kind of buckets which are important to assess early on itself. And lastly, capacity. And if you have to quickly look at what are the components within each of these 5, Harsh, if we can go to the next page, please. Yeah. So in terms of strategic clarity, as I've mentioned, having a clear understanding of what the data exchange brings to the business use case, right? Having a clear view of what it can unlock and cannot unlock, maybe is very important to have at the get-go. As I mentioned, funding and sustainability, not just funding, but ensuring there is a sustainable continuation of it to ensure there is a backing of implementation and adoption eventually, which goes into programs for capacity building, programs for promoting adoption and ease of use, etc. If we can move to the next page. Yeah. In terms of technical readiness, like I mentioned, one is the physical infrastructure itself, right? Whether you have the public-private key infrastructure, whether you have the servers in place to separate the environments which are required for secure data exchange to happen, whether there is digitization of records even in the first place, right? So for many institutions, there is a mix of physical and digital records, and so what does that journey look like to even take place before a true data exchange can kind of be implemented? organization of data, which kind of is related to that. Interoperability and APIs, which I mentioned, how do you ensure that the right level of exposure of APIs is there to promote interoperability and kind of collaboration between institutions. And lifecycle management, like how long should the data be stored? What is private and how in like what time period should it be deleted? Are things to think about like early on itself to set this up for success. If we move to the next page. Yeah, in terms of governance, I think we've covered a bit of this. There's a need for a clear owner of the data, like a particular institution who is going to be responsible for providing access and owning in terms of any real-time changes which are made to database entries. Which institution is kind of going to take responsibility of that? Second is enforcement power. A lot of the challenges that we came across, at least in country implementations of data exchange, is to mandate participation from different institutions in data exchange. There is a inherent nature of protecting one institution's data and not ready almost willingness to share with other institutions. But there is an enforcing power or an enforcing mandate which sometimes is required to kind of like enable that participation. And lastly, the rules that go along with that enforcement power, right? Like while that is there, how do we protect the confidentiality, the privacy of citizens as well as sensitive data, while also promoting like participation and data exchange. If we can move to the next page. Legal and regulatory, right? So ties to the previous point, which is in terms of like there are risks and controls which need to be in place to mitigate those risks, and how can we think about who gets to access what is the level of access that different users will have, and what are the rights that citizens would have whose data is actually being shared amongst institutions. And if you could move to the last piece. Yeah. And lastly, capacity in terms of roles and responsibilities of participating institutions. So the use cases you have prioritized or you would prioritize, there would be teams, institutions, people who will actually be involved in configuring the systems, in testing out data exchange and using them on a day-to-day basis. What are the roles and responsibilities of those individuals? How do we ensure sustainability of skills and make sure that there is inherent capacity within these institutions to continue? How do we not depend solely on vendors to come in and do data exchange configurations and kind of then leave? And that raises a question on sustainability. And so how do we kind of think about these points early on to build strength in-house within these institutions? And lastly, how do we, as a balance to that inherent capacity, how do we also bring in experience of working with external vendors, because they will be critical to configure and bring in and set up these systems? And how do we have experience within these institutions to partner with external technical solutions providers and get the best from them and also work towards a sustainable capacity model in partnership with them? With that, I'll hand it back to Kunal for a spotlight specifically on the Nepal case study.
Thanks so much, Shashank. So now we'll really want to see how this is happening in reality. Last time, if you guys remember, we looked at Cambodia, and now we look at Nepal. And I'll just provide a very quick overview of where Nepal is in its digital journey before I bring in Adesh ji. If you move to the next slide. So Nepal is interesting because there are already strong digital foundations that are in place. There's a digital identity which has almost 20 million citizens enrolled, along with the Nagrik app, which provides about 61 public services. And then you have a very strong data payments ecosystem that's developing in Nepal, different from how it is in India, but 90% of government expenditure transactions are happening digitally. And then there is some cross-agency integration that exists for data exchange, although right now a lot of these are bespoke and point-to-point bilateral rather. if you look at the things that are remaining to be sort of unlocked here, while the ID exists, the authentication integration of ID across government systems is still happening slowly. A lot more services are being available on Nagrik app, but still services require physical submission. And the data exchange system has been planned. There's a plan available, and now really it's about getting into the implementation. So that's the background. If you look at the next slide, yeah, and I think one more click, Harsh. If you recall the framework that Shashank had just presented, if that's applied to Nepal, then it's very interesting to see that eKYC business registrations are the services that have been proposed right now for prioritization within the data exchange. These are still being discussed within the government and then will be approved. In the medium-term roadmap, it's more about cashless healthcare for marginalized citizens. Very high impact, but complex in terms of its implementation. The quicker wins, the low-hanging fruits, or the harder to implement are NOC for outbound students. But a lot of students in Nepal going outside require digitization across the entire scholarship ecosystem. And then you have justice and law enforcement leveraging DPI, which also has impact and feasibility is sorry, can I just request people to be on mute? So this is what the Nepal ecosystem in terms of use cases might look like. As I said, this is TBD. And if we move to the next slide. Now, I do want to bring in Adesh ji, but before that, I think I wasn't able to provide a proper introduction. Adesh ji, looking forward to hearing your thoughts here. But just for everybody, Adesh ji is served as a joint secretary in the IT division of the Ministry of Communications and Information Technology in Nepal, and is a distinguished public sector technology leader and policymaker. He has more than 2 decades of experience across critical government institutions and has been, really driving a lot of Nepal's journeys across secure, inclusive, and digital governance. His career expands across leadership roles in NID, civil registration, cybersecurity, National Cybersecurity Center, and he was the DG for multiple interministerial digital initiatives. Currently, Adeshji is playing a leadership role in the IT and e-governance office that sits within the office of the Prime Minister of Nepal. Adeshji, welcome again.
Thank you, Kunal.
And I'm sure
very kind of you.
We're really looking forward to hearing your thoughts. And I wanted to maybe start with, this whole question of we're talking about a data exchange. We're talking about a number of different ministries that are involved in this, a number of different government departments that are involved in this. Tell us more from your experience, how is that being navigated in the Nepal context, especially since a lot of these departments might be at very different stages of their digital journeys?
Thank you, Kunal. And I think before I answer on the real question, the disclaimer itself from the slide you have that we haven't actually done the data exchange platform actual implementation. So all these are the preparatory part, and what I would be sharing is from the again, thanks to the Dalberg and FCDO team, the initial studies that have been done on the use cases and preliminary assessment of Nepal case. So coming back to the question, if you remember, we had a big transformation of the government from last year, and after the Gen Z movement, one of the core demand from the public was the digitization or the digital transformation of the government itself. Within the last few months, what we have seen is complete changes of ministries and departments, the complete restructurings of the department in the government. In that, the restructuring process, we have seen two parts. One, because of the restructuring, we have added more variables and dynamics within the existing departments and agencies. They are trying to find out where they are, what they are trying to do. We have moved a lot of things from one ministry and another. So this has created one additional dimension to how we should move forward. At the same time, the IT or the technology has been moved from the Ministry of Communication and IT to the Office of Prime Minister. And one of the the thought process behind was to have that the top-down process to be determined when we deploy these big digital transformation, including the data exchange platform. So this is some kind of a new scenario for us. To be very frank, we are also trying to get on board with what has already happened and how do we navigate from this point onward. But very rightly so, even with this restructuring, we would again find ourselves with multiple agencies within the multiple maturity level within that within the digital part, and there would still be both paper and digital form available in a lot of agencies.
Yeah, so it's really about identifying which ones are more ready than the others, and then that's how you will decide to proceed. And in the last edition that we had on this webinar, Adeshi, there was a lot of discussion on the legal and regulatory requirements required as you're starting such an initiative of a data exchange. So I wanted to ask you how you're thinking about the readiness of bringing in certain legal and regulatory laws while also in parallel doing the technical build out of a data exchange system. How do these things come together and are done parallelly? Or is there a sequencing that you need to think of? Any thoughts on that?
Well, at this point, we are also trying to get the new IT Acts and Cybersecurity Act. So in a way, this has been kind of a good opportunity, if needed, to have the legal structures and active, these provisions to be there when the data exchange platform would be ready at some point of time. So we are fortunate in this scenario that we can work parallelly in both of these areas of technology and the legal mandate. My own perspective is even with these bespoke APIs or these interagency coordination, they have come up with some kind of a legal hurdle at some point of time. So I think the legal part has to be there if we want to have the full optimum utilization of data exchange. Otherwise, there would be a technology, but then the agency would be very reluctant to share data without the legal part. So again, it could be a part of an act, or it could be any other kind of a mutual agreements or some kind of a legal framework agreed between the two agencies. But right now we have all alternative open for us at this point. And the only caveat I would like to add is generally the legal process seems very easy, but it takes very, very long time to actually get it through with the parliament, whereas technology generally have some kind of a predictable timeline. So we have to make sure that these two coincide at the time of implementation.
No, that's a very, very good point. And something that we've also learned in the work that we've done with other governments is that at the pilot stage, which is where Nepal is right now, it's really important to identify what are some of the legal laws and regulations, also government structures that are a must, that need to be in place, rather than that being an afterthought, as you're scaling, because that leads to a number of issues, and therefore then leads to lower adoption. Yeah,
Perfectly.
And when we were also doing a lot of analysis in Nepal, and we had the opportunity to go and visit a lot of existing ministries, departments, and we saw that a lot of these departments and ministries have a lot of legacy digital systems in place. Do you see that as, of course, that shows that there's progress being made around digitization, but do you see that as a hurdle as well as you're thinking about a data exchange platform? How do you manage that?
Yes, but again, this could be the smaller of the problem, the actual technology legacy system. I think Sasank has also pointed out, even Caroline, that the structure data structures and the rules, even the metadata that are used in the systems are more of a problem. There are few systems which have been there for a very long time and has a lot of data, but the number of those systems are limited. But we'll find there are a lot of many systems which are newer in version in technology, but the data standards and protocols are quite difficult and different when we want to, kind of aggregate them together to suit either a data exchange or, the alternatives within the technology of data exchange at this point. So yes, there are legacy systems, but the data structures, formats, the rules are even more of a challenge that I see now.
And do you also see this as a initiative that will go down till the level of the provinces and the rural areas? Do you see that as a impact being created at that level as well?
We have to plan for that. If you look at our government structure, the federal government is more into this policy and bigger picture, whereas the service delivery are generally are there in the local level and some in the provincial level. So unless we have some kind of a expansion to the local or even up to the ward level, the actual benefit to the citizens may not be there. So it's very difficult. We have to cover all the terrain, but there has to be some kind of a roadmap where these local and provincial level are part of the bigger data exchange platform.
Yeah. I'm sure as you're, I mean, I'm just stepping away from just the data exchange, but also just curious to bring in your experience across the larger digitization journey that Nepal has had. What are some of the things that you've learned from other countries, peers, as you've looked to digitize, and what might be your advice to other countries? There are a lot of people from different countries who've joined this call as they're looking at their digital transformation journeys, as they're looking at DPI implementation.
Again, we are very new to the DPI engagement in a way that maybe I would not be able to actually advise on the how to go forward, but just sharing on what we have been facing for last couple of years while trying to do the mega digital transformation part is the first would be on the DPI itself. It's not a greenfield, so we generally have some kind of a existing system that has to be a part of a bigger DPI, but then those are legacy system with a lot of existing acts and regulation binding them to the lot of traditional processes. So sometimes it's very easy to move from technology to technology, but the processes, the legal provisions that are associated with the let's say a digital identity or citizenships are so traditional that it takes a lot of time for national ID to actually replace those traditional citizenship. Similarly to the tax and other part, they are so much well coded within their own regulation and systems that it's very difficult to actually intervene with the new connectivity process or new radical business process re-engineering thing. So what we have been facing is one is on that part, second is on the capacity within the institutions, including the civil servant and regulators. So we have to have a lot of talks and the discussion and coordination with these multiple regulators and agencies before even we can put some kind of a roadmap on how to move on to the this DPI based roadmap for the next few years. So these are the two kind of a big things that I can share with you at this point. Thank you.
No, that's very helpful. I guess one last question just I wanted to ask here is, there's always this debate about do we build the perfect system, or do we start somewhere? You know, there's a debate about building right versus building very quickly. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from Vineet from CDPI on this exact thing. But do you have any thoughts on how that should be, looked at?
Yeah, Kunal. I'll just add that we are also doing that debate right now. So at this point, we are planning for both, but still debating on should we go with the smaller thing or should we actually put a lot of effort on not the whole thing, but kind of a significant data exchange. So at this point, I would say that we are planning for both, but this debate has not ended in Nepal also.
Yeah. And I guess that's where the first part of the conversation around use cases becomes also really important, right? Is if you're looking at, showing quick wins and, in 6 months to 12 months, it's also, something that citizens need to see is impacting their day-to-day lives. So it's really important to identify the use cases that you can start with, but also the ones that are not too complex to begin with, where some level of readiness also exists while you slowly build for perfection. Adeshji, thank you so much. This was extremely helpful. Glad you could join. If you're able to stay back, it'll be great because I'm sure there are some questions that will be for you. Otherwise, thank you so much.
I'll try to be here as long as possible. Thank you, Kunal and ADB team for having me here.
Great. Harsh, can we bring back the slides? So now the question which I just asked Adeshji is, well, how can countries accelerate the path to the first versions of their data exchange? Or in other words, how do you think about implementation? How do you think about the first pilot that you do? How do you debate like building perfection or actually getting to those quick wins? And I will now invite Vineet from CDPI to take us through this section. Vineet, take your time. You have about 20 minutes.
Thanks, Kunal. Thank you, Kunal, and thank you, Adeshji, for that candid chat. Super helpful and a great setup for this part of the presentation. Team, if you can just flip to the next slide. Before we start and think about like how do you actually get to first versions of a data exchange, let's do a quick poll and tell me how long do you think it takes to build a data exchange in a country? Again, same thing, pull up your phone, scan the QR code, or go to Menti and maybe start polling. It's the next question.
I think we need to move to the next question.
Yes, thank you. Okay, we have some responses coming in. Currently looking like a neat staircase. Yeah, so this is super and unsurprising, right? Typically, when people think of a data exchange in a country, this procurement itself can take like 6 months or 6 to 12 months, right? Just like writing the PRD takes so long. The thing that I am, and what I'm hoping to do as part of my rest of the slides is probably shift this mindset a little bit, at least for some of you. And maybe the next time someone asks this question, maybe some of you will actually rate 0 to 6 months with the one hopeful person who has voted for that. But on to the next question then. So my question to you would be, what takes so long? Why does it take 12 months, 24 months, or even longer to get it done? Culture change, yeah. And as you think about this, also think of what takes so long to just even get like the first instance up and running, right? Whole of data exchange, streamlining is a decade-long journey. And obviously that will take time. Coordination between ministries, tech infra, ministries should trust each other. I think there's a really sort of good one here. It's really a priority for government departments and ministers, which I think is spot on. No one thinks of data exchange as a priority. They think of delivering the use case, delivering the service. So team, if you can scroll down a little bit just to see. Data pricing is an interesting one. Doesn't come up as often in government to government data sharing, but I think when it comes to private sector data sets, this becomes really important overall. Procurement, yes, is a big one. Law and regulatory governance, as Adeshji mentioned, I think again, very important, and obviously in some cases can be a prerequisite. Hard to define features at the beginning, again, very useful. Sometimes people keep thinking between, should I do an X-road, should I do an API gateway, what does the WSO2 give me, and so on. And that's not even still at the feature level, there's one level higher than that. Failure to understand added value on time, figuring out politics. So all of this is sort of exactly right. And the reality is that, team, we can go back to the slides. The reality is that often it's a confluence of these things, right, in a country. Almost all of this is true at any given point in time in any country that you're dealing with. So it takes actually a long time. Well, I'm here to tell you or ask you this question, which is like, what if you could build in weeks? Not years. I'm not saying months. I'm not saying years. Can you build in a week? Like, can you build in days, essentially? What would it actually take to do that, right? So let's ask ourselves that question. And the reason why I'm asking this question is because the building blocks already exist, right? Like if you think of open source solutions that are available, so like an WSO2 or IUDX or MOSIP's NG or other, right? These are high quality open source solutions that exist, right? And in the chat as well, I think there's someone who has actually shared a few DPGs that are available. There are many. OpenSPP has a registry, Sunbird RC has a registry, right? All of these are high quality open source code that's actually available. Then you have AI, which you hear about this every now and then, which is like, hey, with AI now you can deploy within minutes and crash sort of development times as much as possible. You still need some human oversight, but theoretically, this is still possible, right? That you are able to compress build timelines. You can't fully leave that to AI, but you can compress timelines. You have now, we live in a world where many people actually understand DPI principles, right? What does interoperability actually mean? What does minimalism mean, right? How do you think of federated data sets? How do you think of security and privacy by design, right? This is now, I mean, many countries are at various stages, but people more and more understand what DPI principles mean in practice, right? And then you also have reference implementations to begin with. So Singapore has done it, India, Estonia, Uganda, and there are many others, right? These are just like illustrative examples that I have picked that have already done it. So there are lessons that you can borrow from these things, from these countries, right? And you can sort of leapfrog some of the challenges that these countries have had, right? So the mix of those things, the question I'm asking is, can you actually just do it in a week? Not even weeks, right? So if you go to the next slide, before we go there, I just wanted to leave a resource with you. You can scan the, as the next slide comes up, this question of what type of reference approach can we actually build, right? Which is a Singapore Apex or an Estonia X-Road or a WSO2 implementation UG Hub in Uganda or an API Setu in India. What is it that they actually do versus don't do, right? So what you see here is essentially an abridged version of a comparison between all of these approaches, right? And there's no one approach that works for everyone, right? So if you were to ask us as CDPI, who have done sort of tech architecture advisory to probably at this point 30-35 countries globally, including on data exchange, which is the best platform for you, you'll be like, we'll have to work with you to figure that out, right? In some cases, for instance, in an API gateway in India, there is a central gateway, but there are some APIs that are direct access, right? So listed only APIs just bypass it. Singapore is a central gateway for all Estonia X roads, as many of you would know, it's just fully peer-to-peer, right? Non-repudiation sometimes becomes quite important. It's more fully talked about. Like something like an X roads just gives you full non-repudiation, like signed, time stamped, signed receipts overall. But for like Singapore, India, Uganda, some versions of these things exist, right? And it works for those countries, right? So you don't need the full menu. You have to figure out the full menu that works for yourself. And the detailed comparison on these reference approaches is there on the link, and you can scan the QR code for that. And but the thing that I'm trying to tell you is that the only way for you to actually fully understand this is for you to start building. You can't write a really big PRD. I mean, you can write a big PRD and like procure it, get a vendor to build it and so on. But the reality is that often in like 2 years time, when these systems go live, the requirements itself have changed. And in some cases, governments also have changed, right? So your window of opportunity shrinks. So while you can do that and it has a place in its world, what I'm here to suggest you is that if you go to the next slide, can you actually do it in a week? And my provocation to everyone on here is that let's do it boot camp style. So like those in the tech industry would know, right? Can you get engineers, so a DevOps person, a backend person, a front end, a UI UX person, a process engineer, maybe 2 or 3 ministries, right? Get them in the room. Maybe I work with an IT vendor, get them in a room. Let's lock them in and slide pizza under the door and don't let people out until they have actually built an instance up and running. Can we actually do this? What would something like this actually look like? If you on the next page, the way we think about this is that in a week, on days 1 and 2, we do data exchange 101, right? There was a question as like governments actually don't care, departments don't care about data exchange, right? You do a 101, right? Use cases that Shashank, Kunal, Adeshji mentioned. Let's actually list them down, right? And use cases often are very similar, right? Like if you look at the use cases that we pulled earlier on, the use cases that were there on the Nepal 2x2 that the team showed, there's a significant overlap, right? Many more often than not, business registration is a big one that comes up saying, hey, we just want to make it very easy for sole proprietors in a country to set up and establish a business. It's actually really hard, right? So we need data to flow between departments. Social benefits, eligibility checks, like it's almost always comes up, right? And these are like high powerful use cases. So in those days 1 and 2, you actually take lessons, identify use cases with the people in the room, actually build the user journey, right? Day 3, you instantiate an API gateway. And I'm not making this up. You can instantiate an API gateway in a day. There's high quality code available. Wherever there are gaps, we can plug those gaps. You instantiate a gateway in day 3. Day 4 and 5, you build adapter layers over the highest priority legacy systems, right? So for instance, if it's a civil registry that exists in the country and you want to trigger, you want to check whether someone's married or not, right? And that needs an API. API writing takes 2 hours by a good engineer or 3 hours by a good engineer if you have that access, right? Can you actually do that in day 4 and 5? I would say yes. And we have done it, and I'll show you a little bit more. By end of day 5, you get 2 use cases live. Right? And then day 6, you transition to country's infrastructure. Like you can also sort of start with the country infrastructure, but sometimes countries have access, challenge in accessing the infrastructure right away. But you can build it sort of in like a sandbox environment, but then transition to country infrastructure. So by day 6, you have a working instance of an API gateway running on the country's infrastructure, instantiated by country's engineers, right? And 2 or 3 use cases are live, right, by the end of the week. This is very, very, very possible, okay? So you walk away from that room, not with a deck, not with a roadmap, but really a system that works. So people have seen it, right? They can see the magic happening, which is like if I have to figure out whether someone's actually eligible for this, you click a refresh, it pulls their data from the API, and you can actually see the eligibility list, right? While you're there in the room. And what that does is that it shrinks conceptual conversations that you will have to do with the country teams to be like, oh, data exchange is important because this will reduce time, data will be updated, we will have hygiene and so on and so forth, but be like, hey, come here, look and see, right? On last day, you get the minister or the department head in the room and say, hey, this is the power of what you have actually built, right? And it's a working instance. And the country has the capacity because now they've actually deployed it, right? No vendor has done it. The country, the engineers in the room have actually done it. So they know what is it that they have to actually really build, which is often one of the challenges. I remember you said, you don't know what feature to prioritize, right? Now you will actually see which features you're actually building within this week and not which features you are deprioritizing, right? And you don't have to do this alone. You will have like the DPI experts, for instance, experts from other countries as well who can sort of guide you essentially in this transition. So that's week one, which is what we call the boot camp. Then the next phase of this is this, does this mean you're actually going, sort of you can go live in a week? I would say yes and no, but you need to fortify the build a little bit. And this is where I think the next 6 to 8 weeks will take, right? You need to do security hardening, maybe do cybersecurity checks. Maybe you have to figure out signing between different authorities. You have to figure out, maybe people need to think of like MOUs, like between governments, departments that have to be signed, what data is actually being shared. If there are a few use cases, APIs that are almost online, how do you discover them? So you'll need an API catalog, for instance. Schemas perhaps will have to be put in place. Maybe you need to do SLA commitments for like API uptime and so on. Some maybe UI UX monitoring, you need to do UI UX sort of customization, monitoring and stabilize, just observability, whether the system is actually working, how many API calls and so on or not. And then scalability, right? Like in the week, in the boot camp, you're thinking 2 or 3 use cases, and maybe each of them has like 1 or 2 APIs, but then can you get to 15, 16 of sort of critical endpoints, do load testing, do rate limiting before you can do a little bit of wider rollout? And again, this is 6, 7 weeks of sort of effort, right? Concentrated effort that's actually doable. That's step 2. Like that's sort of the second phase, which is like you fortify what you have built. In the next phase, I would say the next sort of probably week 9 to 16, right? About 2 months or so, you launch. Right? Can you get to 1,000 real users on this new journey? Governments are excellent in while they want to actually get done, right? And they operate in a mission mode. You set up a war room, right? You have a weekly call, you have a daily stand-up call, essentially a cross-agency delivery unit that looks at what are some of these challenges and actually delivering sort of the service to the citizen. Like if you say that the use case is business registration, then can we get the first 100 or 500, whatever the number may be, businesses actually registered through this service? And can you actually shrink that time from days to minutes, right? Let's make that happen, right? And this will take a little bit of time, like what I would say 2 months, 3 months is sort of a good window for us to sort of keep in mind. And I say 1,000 users, not 1, not 10, because like you need to have some real volume, right? You need to see where the drop-offs are happening, where people get stuck and so on. And we're sort of solving on the go. And what this also does is, from a mission mode, is that it keeps the political sponsorship close. Again, this was one of the reasons that was mentioned, that like building trust is actually really hard across ministries, right? But the moment you say, hey, I'm actually moving really fast, you will have political sponsorship, right? Because there is no minister who says, I want to move slow. You go to a minister who's a champion and they will be like, I wanted to get this done yesterday, right? So if you're able to show speed, it keeps my political sponsorship close, and you can actually continue to push forward on this, right? And then in the next phase, I would say maybe about 6 months and beyond, there's still work to be done, right? All the important things around governance, you need to maybe have an API governance committee, you need to have data sharing agreements, schema registries, right? You need to evolve the architecture, for instance, if possible, right? Like Maybe just a plain vanilla API gateway is not enough. Maybe you feel like you need a federated data exchange, and that is okay, right? Maybe you need a push-based system, right? So like the moment someone's civil registration status changes, that data needs to be pushed to different ministries, right? Rather than being pulled through an API call, right? That needs something like an event broker, right? And then maybe you need to retire of the bilateral connections that exist, right? And then you also need to think of like the national model itself, right? Again, getting everyone on board was like one of the first things, and to question of what takes so long. You need to publish like a data schema, right? So if you're fetching address from business registration and you're fetching address from say tax ID, then those two things need to be the same address, right? Should not feel very different, right? And should not be to the department to figure that out, right? So you have to figure out sort of a national data model and so on. And the reason why I'm saying we do this alongside as you are building is because when you build, you will also realize that there are these challenges, right? That the schemas actually don't work, right? Maybe some schemas are okay, maybe some are not, right? Maybe address formats are actually not okay. Correct, as sort of someone mentioned, like semantic interoperability is hugely important, but you build on the go. You won't get that right from the get-go, right? You have to evolve on this on a period of time. And then lastly, you start to open up the rails for the public private sector as well, right? Because remember, DPI is when those rails are also useful by the private sector to offer services to citizens, not just a G2G sharing, right? This is really, really, I think, important. On the next one, many of you will be thinking, what is Vineet saying? This is not how it operates. Like the way you do it is like you write a PRD, do a procurement, and then you get an SI on board, and then they do it. Of course, this is not meant to be a substitute for quote unquote procurement. And I'm using sort of that business as usual approach, as using procurement as a label for that. It's just a faster way to get ready for it, right? Like you need to actually also show value to citizens. You need to have your teams understand what the SI is actually building for you. Otherwise, you get vendor logged in. Otherwise, sort of your data gets logged into a proprietary format, right? And then you're solving for that 6 months later or 12 months later, right? So this is, in our view, not a substitute for saying, hey, I can do this in-house. Of course, if you have capacity, please go ahead and do it. But you can do this alongside that as well. So for instance, once your system is up and running, you should start writing the PRD, right? Figure out like there are many other things that need to happen. Like maybe there are priority use cases that like need purpose-built registries, right? Maybe you need non-repudiation, you need dedicated schema registry, like data protection sign-offs and all of that stuff, right? There are many other things that need to happen, which the core team may not be able to do, right? So those things can still continue to happen alongside. So this is not a replacement. Think of this as sort of a complement. I just want you to think that there's another way possible to standing up data exchange systems in the world. I have 2 slides left, and I'm going to switch gears a little bit. One thing that I'm leaving on the table that's worth considering is that you need to also think of verifiable credentials when you think of data exchange. A verifiable credential, and you can click through team. A verifiable credentials infrastructure is 2 things in one. It's a real-time API to API based data sharing hidden in plain sight. So when a tax authority creates a tax credential, or an education authority creates an education certificate and creates a credential that gets stored into a wallet that the user sends to someone else, the receiving entity will still there are multiple modes that are possible, right? In one of the modes, you will do a deep link with the wallet, call the API of the issuing ministry and get that data. So it is still API to API based data sharing, and the credentialing infrastructure acts as sort of the API gateway in the middle, right? So this hits 2 birds with 1 stone. A, you give the credential back to the citizen, and it also enables sort of real-time data sharing. Again, this is not a substitute for G2G data sharing, right? I would say it's a complement to what you can actually build, right? Last thing I would say, and this is not a theoretical approach. If you go to the next slide, there are countries who are already using this. Colombia, Peru, Dominican Republic are 3 countries where we've already done this. They've stood up infrastructures in these countries and are now in the process of going live. Togo, Benin are next in line. We have a few countries in Asia as well, potentially in the pipeline. So something like this resonates. I'm sure ADB, CDPI, Dalberg, others, many open source partners here as well, will be very happy to support this crew to make this come alive, because it does really take a village, right? And I'm sure we'll be happy to sort of help. So please get in touch and know that this can be done faster. Thank you. Back to you, Kunal and Shashank.
Yeah, thanks, Vineet. Thanks for that. Maybe I'll perhaps just tie that conversation, that presentation out, Vineet, with a question to you, if that's okay. In terms of, you mentioned a few countries where this approach, you've already seen this and kind of maybe also been part of some of those. Was there anything that needed to be in place even for those countries? And since you have mentioned country examples, I assume that they started small and eventually were able to scale. So what would you say were the top 2 or 3 things that needed to be in place as they figured this journey out?
Yeah, good question, Shashank. So I would say not much. What you need is a very clear intent that you need to make this happen. Governments around the world already have IT infrastructure that they are up and running. So there is often more capacity than we think there is available in the country. At the same time, I would say it does need prep work, right? We still need to work with the country to figure out what are some priority use cases for them, what already exists, what does not exist, who will be the people in the room, what does it actually take? Do they have cloud infrastructure, or will they want to do it on-prem? All of those things we still have to figure out. But I would say with a lot of clear intent and a willingness to move quickly, these things can be resolved in a timely manner. Last bit, I would say, more often than not, like each country's policy environment is unique to their own. So in some countries, we probably might have to navigate that. But more often than not, I've seen that like for your ability to do, say, closed group testing, policies don't often come in the way. So those things can also happen in parallel. But that's probably one of the things I will have to check in the pre-work that we do.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Vineet. Perhaps we can take a few questions from the group, but I saw a few come through on chat, and maybe I'll invite Kunal to answer one of these, which was on how can e-governance or digital services continue to be delivered even in unstable or hard to reach areas, whether that is in terms of instability with respect of power or its conflict, in conflict zones, hard to reach areas. How do we keep the continuity of digital services or e-governance priorities even in those areas? Kunal, maybe if I can invite you on that.
Thanks for that question. In fact, I mean, I'll just share maybe an example there, but I'll see if Vineet also you want to comment on this question if you have any thoughts. Maybe one of the examples here would be taking the eKYC use case, right, in India and how that's being done. There is a mechanism in which the ID verification can happen, identification verification can happen offline, because often a lot of the countries that are being more forward-leaning in terms of using data exchanges or generally DPIs are countries where we don't have universal connectivity, or you have sort of inconsistent connectivity. And as you've already asked, like connectivity, power, all of these are issues. So you have to keep that in your design early stage when you're developing a DPI solution. So at least one in India, what the Aadhaar system UIDAI does is that for ID verification, the connectivity challenge happens when you are going to a particular institute, maybe it's a rural bank or a telecom operator to actually where your ID needs to be verified, and that's where the server needs to be pinged and you need connectivity here. What UADI allows the user to do is actually download a digital signature, right? And that's when you need connectivity, but that can be done at a point where there is connectivity, and a digital signature which is verifiable encrypted is issued to the user. Now, when a user actually goes to to institute to do the verification, then there is a verification public key that's actually used where the UADI server is actually not pinged. So offline, that verification can happen. So this is just one example of how, at least on a data exchange, if eKYC is one of the use cases, you can design a system where the UADI server doesn't need to be pinged where an ID authentication is happening. But Vineet, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, spot on. I think our go-to advice to most countries is that you need multiple modes in the country for authentication. So offline and online, and multiple factor authentication as well. So OTP, mobile, face, biometrics, knowledge based, all of those, right? So those two combinations work, and the example that you gave is a great one and works generally with all verifiable credentials implementations. So nothing further to add. The only thing I would add is think both offline, online, and multiple modes of authentication, not just the mobile OTP, but face, biometrics, perhaps others.
Yeah, thanks both. There was, I think, a question for you, Vineet, on the chat, which you have answered, but would see if you want to come in further in terms of ensuring the continuity and sustainability of knowledge, especially with solution providers kind of implementing, setting up some of these systems and perhaps kind of moving out. How do you ensure that kind of that stream continues and is not lost in along with the spirit of moving fast?
Yeah. So I think it's a great question, and I think comes definitely from a practitioner who's been within governments, right, to ask that question. I would say, like, an ability to move fast, I would say documentation often becomes collateral damage, but it should not be. And I think, and we can talk a little bit more and one-on-one on how we have actually done it. But I would say, like, the main thing is actually your ability to understand what is being built in the country, right? Quite or more often than not, like in a traditional sort of requirements, PRD, procurement, SI building, handover, the country comes in too late to be like, oh, what is actually being built? Like they've never seen under the hood, they've never seen the code, right? That's being built. And so that takes a lot of time. Here we are flipping that narrative. We are saying you build in the country, right? So you understand what is actually being built. And then what that means is that every time the service provider or the integrator is actually doing something or pushing a new feature upgrade, wrapping up a sprint, the engineers in the country already know that this was actually upcoming, and they are able to, like, there's curiosity to play with it, tweak with it, and so on. So this capacity building is sort of a main objective of actually doing this, which is that you continue to sort of lead the technical understanding rather than thinking of that as an afterthought. But I would say it's not a solved problem. There are many, many things that need to happen, and just one, there's no silver bullet answer to that.
Thanks for that, Vineet. I see a kind of a theme which I think Navya had started on the chat. Loved that others have also responded on that, but particularly in the sense of legacy systems, and Navya, correct me if I'm wrong, but the context in which you're mentioning legacy systems is there are some institutions or systems which need quite a bit of overhaul in terms of digitization and structuring. And how can we consider them as a use case, even though they may be powerful, they may be reaching a lot of citizens, could add a lot of impact if connected to the data exchange ecosystem. But because they are so far behind in terms of maybe even digitization, right? For example, we have seen these institutions which have a mix of paper-based and kind of digital records. So they often get deprioritized. I think Navya's point was how these also are kind of important considerations to make over there. And that's a fair point. I don't know, Vineet, Kunal, if there's anything you would want to add on that perspective. Maybe one thing that I can share is that and I kind of, this completely resonates, Navya, based on what you're sharing. And I think in addition to identifying these top priority use cases, which, as you're saying, where some of these lesser digitized areas get deprioritized, it is also important to take that opportunity to perhaps start a parallel journey for some of these institutions, and clearly indicate that the level of digitization perhaps is too low for it to participate in a scaled up data exchange ecosystem. But there are smaller steps it can already start to try, to Vineet's point, to try data exchanges and see where the bottlenecks are, and in parallel work towards efforts of standardization, work towards efforts of digitization, setting up those digital systems and records with unique identifiers, which will make the journey possible in a few months' time, if not immediately. So that's something I just wanted to share, where the use case identification process kind of helps you also identify those areas and flag those kinds of areas early. But I also see if Kunal, Vineet, if you had any additional thoughts on that.
No, nothing from me, Shashank. I think you've answered it well.
Sounds good. Maybe we can take one more question, which came through to us, is in terms of where there are institutional silos, right, between different departments, between different ministries, and this gets compounded with the usage of different kinds of systems as well. So when moving towards a unified system at a national scale, so what has been most effective in experience, right, between like the balance between mandate and between kind of fostering participation? What has been most effective that we have seen? Maybe if one of Kunal, Vineet, if you guys wanna take that based on what we have seen from more national scale implementations.
Yeah, I would say that it's a great question, and again, it's one of those things where there's no easy answer. I would say that there you often need a combination of sort of high potential use cases that like are a burning problem for the government, and need to show momentum quickly on that to continue to work, right? Because like I said, like no one wants to work on an initiative that may come live in 12 months or 24 months or 36 months, right? Like if you are able to actually show momentum and say, hey, on this date in X number of weeks, I'm actually going to show you this to you in working, that actually creates a lot of momentum and like political buy-in. So you do definitely need something like that. But I would be lying if I would say that there does not need like any central push. Like quite often you do need like some central push to nudge ministries to departments to start sharing data. But again, varies country by country, but like our sort of preferred view is that you start with the former, that you get a few priority pain points for the government solved, you create value, that in process of doing that, you create a national API sort of schemas, standards, like publish an open API policy for the government, right? And then create artifacts essentially that other people can then onboard, right? And find your champion. Because remember, DPI is not like, while we are saying this, I myself said you can spin this up in a week. DPI is a decade-long journey, right? Like it will take several years and not everyone will come on board live. But I would be really surprised if you're not able to find like the first 5, 10, 15 sort of API endpoints to expose to a data exchange in a country. That I would say is very feasible within a short period of time.
Yeah, super helpful, Vineet. Thanks for that. Maybe we can do one last question. Caro, if you're on, a question that has come for us is the plan for sustainable funding a factor that we consider when providing technical assistance for data exchange projects, right? As ADB or other similar institutions, is the plan for sustainable funding a factor as we look to support?
Thanks so much for the question. It would be really bad if I was just like, no, it is not. So yes, of course, it's a core design principle, of course, for any of the DPI investments that we're looking at, whether it's the technical assistance to do the project preparation, set us up for success for the actual investment loan, or for if it's for the loan itself. So those conversations are happening early with all of the stakeholders and the governments that we're working with. And I think, as we've talked a lot about, that institutional buy-in is key, and having that vision, that's where we're actually seeing some of the challenges, where there might not be that long-term strategy by the government, or who actually has that ownership and can make those calls for long-term sustainability and see the DPI investments as budget line items in the long term, and not just, what next year is the next election. So let's really focus on those types of timeframes. So we see a mix, but as Kunal and Vineet have said, the success that we're seeing is in those much longer term investment sustainability plans, and really starting those conversations, which can be hard and hard to predict early on in the design process. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Caro. I think that brings us to the end of the session. Thank you so much, everyone, for engaging. Harsh, maybe if you can leave the next slide on the screen. Would love to kind of hear from folks just that one thing that you are taking away from this session, and maybe even for those who attended the last session, what is that one thing you have taken away from this? Really enjoyed your participation. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. This has been great to see everyone's questions come through.